did not rush into the house. Instinct told him not to. Instead, he stood beside the truck for a full minute, studying the plantation the same way a detective studies a crime scene. The chain on the gate had been cut cleanly, not broken, not forced, cut with bolt cutters. Professional. The front door of Harlow Hall swayed slightly in the evening wind, opened just wide enough to show darkness inside the hallway. Calder looked down the long dirt road behind him. Empty. Whoever had come here wasn't worried about being seen, which meant one of two things. Either they believed the house was abandoned, or they knew exactly who owned it. He walked to the porch slowly. Every board creaked under his boots. The door pushed open with the lightest touch. Inside, the house was silent, but something had changed. Calder could feel it immediately. The air had that strange stillness a room has after someone has just left. The ledger sat exactly where he had left it on the dining table, but another object sat beside it, a manila envelope. No stamp, no address, just his name written across the front. Thomas Calder. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Block letters, deliberately neutral. Calder opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed. No signature, no greeting, just a short message. You have found something important, but you do not understand what it is. Calder read the rest slowly. Harlow Hall was not the only place where records were kept, and the people who created those records were not all working for the same cause. Some documented injustice, others documented opportunity. Those ledgers were not simply memories, they were assets. Assets people still compete for. Calder frowned. Assets? The letter continued. The network you are uncovering did not end in 1865. It evolved, and some of the families connected to those records became very powerful afterward. Powerful people protect their origins, especially when those origins involve stolen lives. Calder read the final lines twice. You believe you are restoring history. Others will believe you are threatening inheritance. Be careful which doors you open. Not every lost family wants to be found. The message ended there. No name, no clue who had delivered it. Calder looked around the house again. Nothing else appeared disturbed. The observation chamber upstairs was untouched. The cabinet where the ledger had been hidden was still empty. Whoever had entered the house had come for one purpose, to warn him or intimidate him. But the letter had done something unexpected. It had raised a far bigger question. If the Harlow Hall ledger tracked the movement of enslaved people across the South, and if that information continued after the Civil War, then the records might contain the early roots of entire family lineages. Lineages that eventually built businesses, land holdings, political power. Which meant the archive wasn't just about lost families, it was also about who benefited from their disappearance. Calder sat down at the table and opened the ledger again. He began flipping through the entries with new eyes, because the letter had forced him to notice something he had missed before. Some names appeared more than once. Not enslaved people, buyers, merchants, plantation owners. Men who repeatedly purchased people from different auctions across the region. Men who clearly had enough wealth to build networks of labor across multiple states. One name appeared again and again, across dozens of pages. Nathaniel C. Rourke. Cotton broker, river trader, private buyer, and, according to the ledger's notes, someone who often purchased children separately from their parents, which generated more profit, but also more disappearances. Calder pulled out his laptop. The name rang a faint bell. Within minutes, the search results appeared, and suddenly the warning in the envelope made sense. Because Nathaniel C. Rourke wasn't just a forgotten slave trader. He was the founder of a shipping company that still exists today. The modern corporation traces its origins back to river transport operations along the Mississippi. The company's current name? Rourke Logistics Group, a billion-dollar shipping firm headquartered in Atlanta with contracts across the United States, international freight operations, and one of the largest private port facilities along the Gulf Coast. Calder stared at the screen. Because the ledger inside Harlow Hall had documented the early transactions that helped build that fortune. Transactions involving human lives, families torn apart, children sold separately. Which meant the hidden archive didn't just contain stories of resistance, it contained a paper trail that reached directly into the foundations of modern wealth. Calder slowly closed the laptop. The warning in the envelope felt far less mysterious and far more practical. Because exposing the ledger wouldn't just rewrite history. It might force some of the most powerful families in the country to explain where their fortunes really began. Outside, the last light of evening faded behind the trees. The plantation house fell into darkness. But Calder understood something now that made sleep impossible. The people who created the ledger built it as a weapon against forgetting. And weapons don't stay buried forever. Eventually, someone finds them. The real question no longer was whether Calder would publish the archive. The real question was how many people would try to stop him before he could. And judging by the open gate, the answer was already more than zero.
Thomas Calder stood in the middle of the upstairs study holding the letter while the dust from the broken wall settled slowly through the air like ash after a fire. The carpenter who had pulled the panel away, an old man named Leonard Pike, was staring at the pile of paper spilling from the wall cavity as if it had crawled out on its own. No one spoke, because even before they started reading, something about the discovery felt wrong. Not frightening. Worse than frightening, intentional. The cavity behind the wall had not been used casually. Whoever filled it had packed the letters with an obsessive precision, layer after layer, folded, compressed, and wedged into every inch of space between the studs. This wasn't a hiding place, it was an archive. Calder crouched down and started pulling the bundles apart. The paper was brittle but surprisingly preserved in the center of each folded stack, protected by the tight pressure of everything around it. Ink still visible, names still readable, dates still clear. The plantation had been built decades before the Civil War, but most of the letters seemed to come from the years just before it, years when the machinery of the old Southern economy had been running at its most ruthless efficiency. Calder expected plantation correspondence, crop yields, rice shipments, trade agreements. Instead, the first full letter he unfolded began with words that made his stomach tighten. Brother Samuel was taken in the night. Calder read it again, slowly, carefully. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate, every word pressed deep into the page as if the writer feared the ink itself might disappear. Brother Samuel was taken in the night. They said he was sold to a man from the western counties. No one will say where exactly. Mother has asked every overseer and every clerk. No one will answer. The letter ended without a signature, only a mark, a small circle drawn beside the final line. Calder set it aside and picked up another. This one was older, the paper thinner, the writing more controlled. We are keeping the record. Even if they burn the books, we will know where everyone went. Another mark at the bottom, a vertical line. Another letter, another disappearance. Another mark, circle, dash, cross, line. The symbols repeated over and over across dozens of letters. Calder realized he wasn't reading random correspondence. He was looking at a coded system. Someone had been documenting people, tracking them, recording what happened when they vanished from the plantation. And the deeper Calder dug into the stacks of paper, the more disturbing the pattern became. Names appeared that did not exist in the plantation's official records, children whose births had never been registered, women described only by family relationships, daughter of Miriam, son of Jacob, baby taken before sunrise, and nearly every name a symbol. At first, Calder assumed they were personal marks, maybe signatures, maybe something cultural. But Leonard Pike was the one who noticed the pattern. The old carpenter had been quietly reading over Calder's shoulder, then he leaned down and picked up a different letter from the floor. His face changed, slowly. The kind of expression a man makes when he realizes he has accidentally walked into something sacred or dangerous. "You see this?" Pike said. He pointed at a small horizontal line beside a name. Then he pointed at another letter across the room, the same mark, next to a different name. Calder looked closer. The same marks were appearing again and again, dozens of times, which meant something terrifying. This wasn't just documentation, it was classification. Someone had built a system for tracking what happened to people after they were sold, where they went, who took them, whether they lived, whether they died. Which meant whoever created this record had access to information that enslaved people were never supposed to know. And that raised a question far more disturbing than the letters themselves. Who inside that plantation had the power to gather this information without being caught? Because the walls of the house weren't just hiding a few desperate messages, they were hiding decades of intelligence, the kind of intelligence that could expose the entire economic machinery behind the plantation system. And the more Calder read, he realized something else. The person writing these letters wasn't just observing what was happening, they were anticipating the future, preparing for a day when someone would need to know exactly how the system worked. Which meant these letters weren't written just for the people living at the plantation. They were written for someone who hadn't even been born yet, someone who would one day tear the walls open, someone who would finally read the truth. And standing there in that dust-filled study, Thomas Calder slowly realized something deeply unsettling. The letters had been waiting for him. But the question that would haunt him for the next 3 years wasn't who wrote them. It was something far more dangerous. Who else already knew they were there?
By the end of the first day, the study floor looked like the aftermath of a paper storm. Letters everywhere, fragments of them, whole pages mixed with torn pieces that had clearly been ripped apart before they were hidden. Some were folded carefully, others crumpled as if they had been destroyed in anger and then reconsidered. Thomas Calder sat at the desk that had once belonged to the plantation owner and began laying the letters into rough piles. Dates, names, symbols, patterns. He had built his career turning chaos into structure. Real estate development demanded it. Land deals, zoning battles, financial risks. Every problem became manageable once you mapped it. So he treated the letters like a business problem. Organize first, understand later. Within 2 hours, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Most of the letters were not written to the same person. Different hands, different voices, different levels of literacy. Some sentences were elegant, written in a controlled script that suggested formal education. Others struggled just to stay straight on the page. But the symbols beside the names, those were always identical. The same circle, the same horizontal line, the same cross, the same vertical tally marks, over and over. Which meant something critical. The people writing these letters were not inventing the symbols themselves. They were following a system. Someone had taught them. Someone who understood writing, organization, and secrecy well enough to design a language that could survive being hidden inside a wall for 100 years. Calder spread out 3 letters side by side. Each one mentioned a different name, But beside those names, the same small circle appeared. He flipped through the pile again and found another letter with the same symbol, then another. 7 letters total, all with the circle, each describing the same outcome in slightly different ways. Gone before sunrise, taken during transport, found in the marsh after the storm. The circle meant death. Calder felt a quiet chill crawl through his chest. He kept searching. The horizontal dash appeared next to dozens of names. Those letters described sales, transfers, movements to other plantations, but not vague ones, specific ones. Sold to the western buyer near the river county, sent to the cotton fields beyond Savannah, moved south after the fever season. Every detail carefully preserved, which meant whoever created the system wasn't just documenting loss, they were building a map of the human trafficking network that fed the southern plantation economy. And that realization carried a weight most history books avoided saying out loud. Plantations didn't just produce crops, they produced disappearances. Families separated, children moved like currency, people turned into inventory. But the official records never told that story, because the official records were written by the men who owned the system. What Calder was holding in his hands was the shadow ledger, the one written by the people trapped inside it. And the more he organized the letters, the clearer the structure became. 3 primary symbols: circle, dead; dash, sold; cross, unknown. But the most unsettling mark wasn't any of those. It was the tally marks. Short vertical scratches drawn beside certain names. 5 lines grouped together, then 5 more, and sometimes 5 more after that. At first, Calder assumed they represented time, days, weeks, months. But Leonard Pike noticed something else. He picked up a letter near the edge of the pile and pointed to the marks beside a child's name. "Count those," he said quietly. Calder did. 20. He flipped to another letter mentioning the same name. 25. Another. 30. The tally marks weren't measuring time. They were measuring attempts. Attempts to locate someone who had vanished into the plantation economy. And suddenly, the system made horrifying sense. Someone had been tracking missing people, relentlessly, patiently, across years, across counties, across states. Whoever created the system believed something radical for that time. They believed the truth mattered more than survival, because writing any of this down could have gotten them killed. But that realization led to a deeper question, one that made Calder's skin prickle with unease. If this system required literacy, organization, and access to information from the plantation's internal records, then the person who created it wasn't just another laborer in the fields. They had to be inside the house, close to the owners, close enough to hear transactions, close enough to see documents, close enough to understand the entire machine. Someone trusted, someone invisible, someone the plantation owners never imagined could be watching them. And somewhere inside the letters, that person had left their mark. Not a name, not yet, but a presence, a voice that appeared more frequently than the others, a voice that spoke with calm authority, a voice that wrote not like a victim, but like an architect. And when Calder finally found the first full letter written in that hand, he realized something that would keep him awake for the next several nights. The writer wasn't just documenting the system, they were studying it, learning it, mastering it, because they weren't trying to destroy the machine, they were trying to outthink it. And that meant the plantation had once contained something far more dangerous than rebellion. It had contained intelligence, a quiet mind moving through the house, recording everything, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the day when the walls would finally break open and the truth would escape. The more Thomas Calder read, the more he understood something that most men never want to admit. Power leaves fingerprints. Not the obvious kind, not signatures on documents or names carved into buildings. Real power hides itself. It moves quietly, behind systems, behind rules, behind paperwork. And if you want to understand how power really works, you stop looking at what people say, you look at what they hide. The plantation house was beginning to reveal exactly that. By the second week of renovation, Calder ordered the entire east wing opened. Not demolished, opened. Walls removed carefully, every cavity inspected. Because the first discovery had already taught him something. The letters in the study were not random. They were organized, which meant there were probably more, and he was right. 3 days later, a worker pulling floorboards in the hallway outside the study uncovered another sealed pocket beneath the planks, smaller, but even more disturbing. Inside were objects wrapped carefully in scraps of cloth that had decayed into fragile threads. Calder unwrapped the first bundle slowly. It was a button, brass, heavy, the kind used on military coats in the mid-1800s, but it wasn't American. Stamped faintly on the back were markings none of the workers recognized. The second bundle contained a coin, foreign, worn smooth with age. The third bundle contained something that made the room go silent. A child's shoe. Tiny, leather cracked but preserved just enough to see the careful stitching along the edge. Inside the shoe was a folded scrap of paper. Calder unfolded it. 2 words, 1 symbol. Taken south. Beside the words, the same horizontal dash. Sold. The shoe had belonged to a child who had been sold, and someone had kept it, wrapped it, hidden it beneath the floor of the plantation house. Evidence, not sentimental memory, evidence. The fourth bundle was stranger still, a wooden disc about the size of a poker chip, one side smooth, the other carved with a pattern of intersecting lines that none of the workers could identify. But Calder noticed something else. The pattern matched the shapes of the tally marks found beside names in the letters, which meant this object wasn't decorative. It was a tool, part of the system, a physical key to the coded record. Calder sat down on the dusty hallway floor, holding the disc, while a realization settled slowly into place. The letters weren't just messages, they were fragments of a much larger structure. Someone had built a secret intelligence network inside the plantation itself, a network that documented disappearances, tracked buyers, recorded destinations, and preserved proof in ways that would survive even if the letters themselves were destroyed. This wasn't the desperate act of a few enslaved people scribbling notes in secret. This was strategy, organization, counterpower. Someone inside the house had been running a quiet resistance operation for years, maybe decades, and the plantation owners had never seen it, because systems of domination always share the same blind spot. They assume obedience means ignorance. They assume silence means submission. But sometimes silence means observation. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones collecting the most information. Calder felt that truth settling deeper into his mind the more he studied the letters, because the plantation owners had believed they controlled everything, the land, the labor, the people, the records. But they had missed one thing, the human mind. You can control bodies with force, you can control behavior with punishment, but the mind keeps its own ledger. And somewhere inside this house, someone had turned that private ledger into a weapon. The question that now haunted Calder wasn't simply who created the record, it was how long they had been doing it. because the letters spanned more than 20 years, which meant the system had survived multiple plantation owners, multiple overseers, multiple generations of watchers. This wasn't one brave person, it was succession. Knowledge passed quietly from one keeper to the next, a hidden archive growing year after year inside the very structure meant to suppress it. And that meant something deeply unsettling. Whoever started the record had trained others to continue it, which meant the plantation had once contained a teacher, someone who understood writing, accounting, coding, someone who could teach those skills secretly, someone who moved freely inside the house, someone trusted by the people who owned the place, someone who could read the master's books and quietly rewrite the truth beside them. And as Calder returned to the study that evening, carrying the objects they had found beneath the floorboards, he realized something that made the back of his neck tighten. The writer he had noticed earlier, the one whose handwriting appeared most often, the one whose letters sounded calm, precise, strategic, that voice had not been desperate, it had been patient. Patient in a way that suggested long-term thinking, and men who think long-term rarely work alone, which meant somewhere inside the remaining walls of that plantation house there might still be something far more important than letters, the original record, the master document, the one that explained the system, the one that revealed the architect behind it. And if Calder was right, that document was still hidden somewhere inside the house, waiting, because whoever built the archive designed it to survive discovery, which meant the letters Calder found first were never meant to be the final truth. They were bait, a first door, and behind it, the real story was still buried.
The deeper Thomas Calder dug into the house, the more the plantation stopped feeling like a building and started feeling like a machine. Not a machine made of gears and levers, a machine made of silence. Old houses speak in sounds if you listen long enough. Wood settles, pipes whisper, floors breathe with the night air. But Harlow Hall carried a different kind of silence, the kind that comes from things deliberately hidden. 3 weeks after the first wall was opened, Calder ordered the third floor inspected. No renovation had been scheduled there yet. The roof sagged slightly, and the upper rooms smelled of damp wood and old heat. But Calder had begun to think like the person who built the hidden archive. If someone wanted a record to survive a century, they wouldn't hide everything in one place. They would scatter it, layer it, bury pieces in different parts of the house so that even if one discovery was destroyed, the rest could still survive. So the workers moved upward, room by room, panel by panel, and eventually they reached a wall that didn't make sense. Leonard Pike noticed it first. The old carpenter knocked on the plaster with the back of his knuckles and listened. Every builder knows the sound of a wall with space behind it. But this wall sounded wrong, too hollow, too long. The measurements didn't match the outside of the house, which meant something every renovation crew eventually finds in old buildings, a false partition. But this one was different. Most false walls hide pipes or chimneys. This one hid a space large enough for a man to stand in. When they broke through the plaster, the room went silent again, because behind the wall was not storage. It was a narrow chamber, 4 feet wide, 7 feet long, bare wood boards on the floor, no furniture, no windows, but someone had lived inside it. Not briefly, for a long time. The floorboards were worn smooth in the center. Dark stains marked a spot where a lantern or candle had once sat repeatedly. And along the inside wall, running from knee height to shoulder height, were hundreds of vertical scratches, tally marks, hundreds of them, grouped in sets of 5, the same symbol system used in the letters.
Calder stepped into the space slowly. He could feel the air change the moment he crossed the threshold. The smell of old wood, old dust, and something else. Something that made the room feel less like a hiding place and more like a watchtower. Because the narrow chamber had one critical feature, a small crack in the outer wall, barely visible from inside, invisible from outside, but perfectly positioned to look down over the plantation grounds. From that slit in the wood, someone could see the main yard, the carriage road, the field path leading toward the slave quarters. It wasn't just a hiding place, it was an observation post. Someone had spent hours in that chamber, watching the plantation, recording what they saw. Calder ran his hand across the tally marks. Some were deep and deliberate, others shallow, rushed. Different hands, different moments, which meant the room had been used across years, maybe decades. But the most chilling detail sat in the corner, a small wooden crate. Inside were scraps of paper, too damaged to read. Rot had eaten most of them. But one fragment remained intact enough to decipher. Calder held it close to the window light. 2 lines survived. Keep the count. And below it, if we stop counting, they disappear. The weight of that sentence settled into the room like a presence, because that was the real horror of the plantation system. Not just the violence, not just the control, it was the disappearance. People removed from the world so completely that even their names vanished from history. But someone inside Harlow Hall had refused to let that happen. They had turned memory into resistance, counting every person who was sold, every child taken, every body buried, and that chamber had been their command center, their private war room inside the enemy's house. Calder stepped back out into the hallway slowly because a new realization was beginning to form. The person who ran this system had not been hiding in fear. They had been hiding in position, close enough to the master's office to hear transactions, close enough to watch the yard at night, close enough to move through the house unnoticed. Which meant the architect of the archive wasn't someone working in the fields. They were someone who lived inside the plantation house itself. A servant, a clerk, a house manager, someone invisible to the men who owned the place, someone educated enough to read their ledgers and rewrite them in secret. And somewhere in the thousands of hidden pages Calder uncovered, that person had left a signature. Not their name, not yet, but their voice, a voice that appeared again and again in the letters, calm, precise, commanding, a voice that wrote like someone who understood power better than the men who thought they owned it. And the more Calder studied that voice, the more unsettling the truth became. Because whoever this person was, they hadn't just been documenting the system, they had been building something far more dangerous, a record designed to outlive the plantation itself, a record that could one day expose the entire structure of power that depended on silence. And the moment that record left the walls of Harlow Hall, 100 years of carefully protected lies would begin to collapse. Which meant Calder had stepped into something bigger than history. He had stepped into a story powerful people had spent generations making sure no one would ever read.
When a man begins to uncover truth that powerful people buried, something strange happens. The world around him starts changing. Not dramatically at first, just small shifts. Phone calls that end too quickly. Questions from strangers that feel a little too precise, glances that linger longer than they should. Thomas Calder didn't believe in paranoia, he believed in leverage. But by the 4th week of digging into the walls of Harlow Hall, even he began to sense something tightening around the edges of his project.
The first sign came from the county office. Calder had gone into town to pull property records. Nothing unusual. Any developer does it before making big decisions: taxes, previous owners, land boundaries. But when he asked the clerk for the historical deed chain on the plantation, the man behind the counter hesitated. Not long, just long enough to notice. Then the clerk disappeared into the back room. 10 minutes passed. When he returned, he placed a thin folder on the desk. Too thin. Calder opened it. The chain of ownership jumped from 1869 directly to 1922. More than 50 years missing. Calder looked up. "Where's the rest?" The clerk shrugged. "Those are the surviving records." Surviving. Interesting word. Calder pushed the folder closed. He didn't argue. He didn't need to, because men who hide information always leave the same trace behind: the shape of the gap. And that gap told Calder something very important. The history of Harlow Hall had been cleaned, not lost, cleaned. Someone had removed records deliberately, which meant someone had known exactly what the plantation's past contained, and they decided certain parts of it should never be easily found. Calder drove back to the plantation with a quiet tension settling into his chest, because this meant the letters inside the walls weren't just historical curiosities, they were surviving evidence. Evidence that contradicted the official story. And if the official story had been edited, someone must have done the editing. But the second sign came later that night. Calder was alone in the study organizing the letters when he heard tires crunch on the gravel road outside the house. He looked out the window. Headlights stopped at the edge of the property. Not approaching, just sitting there, watching. The car stayed for almost 20 minutes, engine running. Then it slowly turned around and disappeared down the road. No one knocked, no one spoke, but the message was clear. Someone had noticed the renovation. The next morning, Leonard Pike refused to come back to work. He didn't give a long explanation, just stood beside his truck, staring toward the plantation house like a man looking at a storm building over the horizon. "You ever notice something about old places like this?" Pike said quietly. Calder leaned against the porch railing. "What's that?" "They don't keep secrets by accident." Pike spat into the dirt. "Secrets that last 100 years, those are guarded." Calder didn't answer, because deep down he knew the carpenter was right. Powerful systems don't just erase evidence, they create silence around it. Fear, social pressure, unwritten rules about what subjects people simply don't bring up. The plantation system hadn't just controlled labor, it had controlled narrative. And narratives protect power long after the original system collapses, which meant if Calder continued digging, he wouldn't just be uncovering history, he would be disturbing the story people had agreed to tell about that history. And men who benefit from a story rarely enjoy seeing it rewritten. But Calder had already crossed the line. The letters, the coded symbols, the observation chamber, the hidden objects beneath the floor, all of it pointed to one undeniable truth. Someone inside that plantation house had created a shadow record of the slave trade. Not rumors, not memories, evidence. Detailed, systematic, accurate. And if that record ever became public, it would reveal something modern America preferred not to examine too closely. The plantation economy wasn't just cruelty, it was organization, precision, logistics, a business model. And the letters hidden in Harlow Hall were exposing the supply chain, which meant the architect of that hidden archive hadn't just been brave, they had been strategic. They had documented the system in a way that could destroy the myth surrounding it. And suddenly Calder realized something unsettling. The letters weren't simply historical artifacts, they were a weapon. a weapon designed to survive long enough for the right person to find it. But that realization carried the second thought, darker and harder to ignore. If the letters were a weapon, then someone else might already know exactly how dangerous they were. Which meant the quiet car on the road last night might not have been curiosity, it might have been reconnaissance. Because the moment buried truths start resurfacing, the people who built the burial start paying attention again. And Calder was beginning to understand something men discover too late. There are two kinds of secrets in the world. The kind nobody cares about, and the kind powerful people will spend generations making sure stay hidden. The plantation letters were starting to look like the second kind, which meant Calder now faced a decision most men never want to make. Stop digging, or find out exactly how deep the silence around Harlow Hall really went. And the dangerous part? He was beginning to realize the letters weren't the final discovery, they were just the introduction. Because somewhere in the house there had to be the original ledger, the master record, the document that explained everything. And if the letters are this explosive, whatever was still hidden deeper inside the plantation walls could be something far more powerful. Something that might explain why the past had been erased so carefully, and why someone might still be watching the property a century later.
There is a moment in every investigation when curiosity stops being casual and becomes commitment. Thomas Calder crossed that line the night he started mapping the letters. Not reading them, mapping them. He spread every document across the long dining table in the plantation house, hundreds of pages, fragments of ink and memory pulled from behind walls and beneath floorboards. At first, the letters had felt chaotic, voices speaking in desperation, pieces of a broken story. But when Calder began organizing them by symbol, the chaos transformed into something else entirely. Structure. Rows of names, dates, symbols beside each one. Circle, dash, cross, and then the tally marks. What had once looked like scattered testimony suddenly formed something chillingly precise. A database, long before computers, long before modern record systems. Someone inside the plantation had built a human tracking network. And once Calder began charting the names geographically, the scale of it became undeniable. The letters referenced plantations across South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, even Louisiana. People taken from Harlow Hall had been scattered across the entire southern agricultural system, but whoever built the record hadn't stopped tracking them. They had followed the trail, transaction by transaction, sale by sale, like a detective hunting through the shadows of the slave trade. Calder leaned back in his chair slowly as the map on the table took shape. This wasn't a desperate attempt to remember loved ones. This was intelligence gathering. Someone had been studying the system like a strategist studies an enemy, understanding its routes, its buyers, its habits. And that raised a question so dangerous, Calder almost didn't want to say it out loud. What if the person who created the ledger hadn't just been documenting injustice? What if they had been preparing to dismantle it? Because knowledge is power, but only when it's organized. And the plantation letters were organized with the precision of someone who understood systems, supply chains, human movement, power relationships. Calder flipped through one of the more intact letters again. This one written in the calm, steady hand he had started recognizing as the central voice of the archive, the strategist, the teacher, the architect behind the hidden record. The letter wasn't emotional, it was analytical. It described a transaction that happened 2 days earlier. 3 people sold, a woman, her son, another man from a neighboring plantation. But the writer didn't focus on the tragedy. They focused on the buyer, where he came from, how he negotiated,
which overseer handled the deal, which route his wagon took leaving the property, and most importantly, what plantation he likely intended to deliver them to. It read less like grief and more like surveillance. The last line of the letter made Calder pause. The buyer returns every 2 seasons. His accounts are known to the house ledger. If the pattern holds, the next purchase will be in October. Calder looked up from the page slowly. That sentence changed everything, because it meant the person writing the letters wasn't simply observing the system. They were predicting it, studying its patterns, learning how the machine operated. And men or women who study systems like that usually have a reason. Sometimes it's survival, sometimes it's power, but sometimes it's preparation. Calder stood and walked to the window overlooking the dark fields outside. The plantation had once been a node in one of the most brutal economic systems in human history. But hidden inside that system, someone had been building a counter-record, a quiet archive designed to expose how the machine worked from the inside. And that kind of knowledge is dangerous, not just to the people who built the system, but to the myths that protect it. Because if the public ever saw the full map of the slave trade, its logistics, its private transactions, its hidden markets, the narrative of simple history would collapse. People would see what it really was, a network, organized, calculated, maintained by businessmen, politicians, and respectable families who preferred their names to remain buried under polite silence. And suddenly, Calder understood something that made his pulse slow. The plantation ledger wasn't just documenting cruelty, it was documenting power. Who had it, how they used it, where it moved. Which meant if the full archive ever surfaced, it wouldn't just rewrite the story of Harlow Hall, it could expose the skeleton of the entire system. And that realization made the quiet car on the road nights earlier feel much less random. Because men who benefit from hidden systems rarely appreciate historians digging into their foundations. Calder turned back toward the table, toward the hundreds of letters spread across the wood, toward the careful handwriting of a mind that had been operating quietly inside the plantation house more than a century earlier. A mind patient enough to document everything, smart enough to hide it, and confident enough to believe that one day someone would find it. But the deeper Calder looked into the letters, the more one mystery refused to leave him alone. The writer never named themselves, not once. No signature, no identity, only the same steady voice appearing again and again across decades of pages. Which meant the architect of the secret archive had chosen anonymity deliberately. But anonymity minds leave clues, in language, in patterns, in decisions. And Calder was starting to notice something strange. The writer knew the plantation's official records extremely well, too well. They referenced transactions that only someone inside the house could access, which meant the architect of the secret archive worked close to the plantation owners, close enough to read their books, close enough to see their private ledgers, close enough to learn their secrets. And that realization brought Calder to a single unavoidable conclusion. The person who created the hidden record had not been an outsider. They had lived inside the house, trusted, invisible, watching everything. And somewhere in the letters, they had left a final piece of evidence, something that would reveal who they really were. Calder just hadn't found it yet.
By the 6th week, Thomas Calder stopped thinking of the plantation as property. He started thinking of it as a crime scene, because every discovery inside Harlow Hall followed the same pattern. Something had happened. Someone had recorded it, and then someone else had tried to erase it. The letters were the first layer. The observation chamber was the second, but the real breakthrough came from a place no one expected, the overseer's office. It sat at the rear of the house, a smaller room with a built-in cabinet that had likely stored payroll ledgers and plantation supply records during the 1800s. Most of the original furniture had rotted away long ago, but the cabinet itself remained fixed into the wall. Solid oak, heavy, old craftsmanship. One of Calder's workers tried to remove it during demolition and discovered something strange. The cabinet didn't sit flush with the wall. There was a hollow space behind it. When they pried it loose, the truth finally started to show itself. Behind the cabinet was a narrow compartment barely wide enough to hold a stack of books. Inside sat a single ledger, wrapped in cloth, protected far more carefully than anything else found in the house. Calder lifted it slowly. Even before opening it, he understood something. This was not a random document. This was the center of the system. The cloth had preserved it remarkably well. When he opened the cover, the handwriting inside confirmed his suspicion immediately. It was the same calm, precise hand he had seen in dozens of letters. The architect, the strategist, the mind behind the hidden archive. But the ledger wasn't written like a diary. It was structured like accounting records, columns, dates, names, symbols. But the names were different from the plantation's official books. Many of them had never appeared in public records, which meant this was the shadow ledger, the real record of what had happened at Harlow Hall. Calder turned the pages slowly. Every entry documented something the official plantation accounts ignored. Children born but never registered. People sold privately to avoid taxation. Transactions conducted through unofficial buyers. Families separated deliberately because individual sales generated more profit than keeping them together. Each entry ended with the same coded symbols he had seen in the letters: circle, dash, cross. But now the symbols were explained. At the front of the ledger was a small key, written carefully, almost clinically. Circle, died on property. Dash, sold, destination known. Cross, sold, destination unknown. Tally marks, attempts to locate. Calder sat in silence for several minutes, because the ledger wasn't just recording disappearances, it was tracking them afterward. Every page showed someone trying to follow the trail of people after they left the plantation, recording rumors, market sightings, travel routes, overseers' names, buyer habits. This was intelligence work, real intelligence work, the kind modern investigators would recognize immediately. Someone had been building a map of the slave trade from inside the system itself. But the most chilling discovery came halfway through the ledger. The handwriting changed, subtly, still careful, still disciplined, but slightly larger, slightly less steady. The transition happened around 1863, which meant the original writer had stopped, either forced to stop or replaced. Someone else had taken over the record, someone trained in the same system. The knowledge had been passed down, which meant this archive had never been the work of one person. It had been a chain, a lineage of record keepers inside the plantation house, each one continuing the work when the previous one could no longer do it. Calder turned the pages further. The final entries were written in the second hand. The last one dated 1865, the year the Civil War ended, the year slavery legally collapsed. The final line in the ledger read, "War changes the law. It does not restore the lost." Then, beneath it, one final symbol. Not circle, not dash, not cross, a new mark, a small square. Calder flipped back through the cipher key at the front of the book. The square symbol had only one definition: location recovered. Calder leaned back slowly, because that meant the record keepers hadn't just tracked where people were taken, they had eventually found some of them again. Families, children, relatives scattered across the South. They had followed the trails until people were reunited.
The archive wasn't just a record of tragedy, it was a recovery operation. And suddenly, the entire project made sense. The letters, the symbols, the tally marks, the observation chamber, the ledger. Someone inside the plantation house had built an underground information network designed to reconnect families torn apart by slavery, and they had done it under the noses of the very people profiting from the system. Calder closed the book carefully, because the scale of what he had found was now undeniable. This wasn't just history, this was proof. Proof that enslaved people had resisted the system not only with rebellion or escape, but with intelligence, strategy, documentation. They had preserved their own truth while the official record erased it. But one question still lingered, one that made the silence inside the plantation house feel heavier every night. Who started the ledger? Who was the first mind brave enough to begin recording the system from the inside? Because whoever that person was, they understood something most people in power still refuse to understand today. If you control the story, you control the future. And if someone had spent decades secretly rewriting that story, there were probably people who would prefer the ledger stayed buried. Which meant Thomas Calder had just uncovered something far more dangerous than a forgotten plantation record. He had uncovered a weapon made of memory. And the moment memory becomes dangerous, the guardians of silence start moving. Because power can survive many things, but the one thing it fears most is proof.